everybody. Wow, it is so amazing to see all of you out here and talk about an all-star panel. I feel incredibly lucky to be sitting here, all of you incredibly lucky to be sitting there. So I want to jump right into this because obviously we don't need to introduce our guests or give a biography. But I would say if the relationship between the public, politics, and technology were on a bell curve and the bell curve was tension, we're pretty much, I feel like, reaching the top. What started with a flirtation evolved into a love affair, and now people are in need of some couples counseling, I think. So, to start off, Tony, Rome, who is being left behind?
Well, first of all, Hadass, thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be with Ro as well, whose work I admire greatly. The people being left behind are the people who don't understand how technology is changing the world, who feel that the force of globalization is passing them by. And the big challenge, what my institute works on and my fascination today, is how do you get the people who are making the changes in the world, the change makers, who are represented here today, how do you get the change makers and the policy makers together? Because technology will change the world, but we have to work out the ways that it changes it fairly and the ways that we make sure that there's access to this new world for those that otherwise are going to be left behind, communities or people. Now, I think what's interesting for me is coming from my background and my age group. I mean, I should say that this won't apply to you, but for me, my children tell me that I should never talk about technology in public. Because they say they have vast accumulated evidence that I don't understand it. But what I do understand is that this is a technological revolution we're living in that is the 21st century equivalent of the Industrial Revolution. And when you look at the Industrial Revolution, politics took decades to catch up with the impact. And I want to shorten that curve today. So I want the policymakers and the change makers to realize they've got a common interest in accessing the benefits of the technology, mitigating its downside effects, and making sure we can use technology to make the world a better place. That's my basic view.
Deborah, you literally represent these companies, and you are a policymaker right now. Do you think that these companies recognize that people are being left behind, and are they doing enough to try and bridge that gap between the haves and the understands and the have-nots?
Well, Hadass, thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here with Prime Minister Blair. I would say, and people in Silicon Valley believe, that Prime Minister Blair, more than perhaps any world leader, understands the consequences and promises of the technology revolution. The reality is that technology has enriched our lives in so many ways, in enhancing communication, enhancing the promise of medicine, enhancing the possibility of information. And yet that innovation and wealth has been concentrated in a few areas. And people in Silicon Valley are increasingly aware that many have been left out in rural America, in minority communities. And the challenge for us is how to make sure that the modern jobs, the new industries, are spread to those areas so that they have an opportunity to diversify in those communities. Our country will fall apart if we don't integrate and provide those opportunities to these places that have been left out. Put simply, no child should be forced to leave their hometown simply to get a good job. And I think there's an increasing awareness of that in Silicon Valley.
Something really interesting that happened this week was Apple announced $2.5 billion in pretty much financial aid to help address the housing crisis in California. Do you see this as a good thing for your region?
Absolutely. I mean, you can't afford to buy a house in my district, or $3,000 a month is basic rent in most of the cities. So Apple
for a one-bedroom, right?
For one bedroom. So Apple and Tim Cook is very passionate about making sure we have more affordable housing. There's two things I'd say about that, though. This is why there's an economic incentive for technology companies to spread. When you look at the increased wages in our area and the increased housing prices, it makes sense for them to look for talent in West Virginia and Iowa and South Carolina from an economic perspective. Second, private sector can't solve this alone. You need policies that are going to encourage more dense housing near public transportation.
Is that realistic to think that tech could be spread out around a country, around a region? We've seen that also happen in the United Kingdom, where media and tech companies are trying to encourage jobs in other cities. Is that realistic? Can that happen, or does government need to put a hand in there and force it to happen?
Yeah, the government's got to be active. But of course it can happen, and it's got to happen in the end. But you see, if you take virtually, well, when I left office, you would have a debate around policy, and you debate healthcare, education, transport, law and order, how does government reform, and then there would be a debate about technology. Today, the question of technology should run throughout government. I mean, my view is you need to reorder politics around handling this technological revolution. It should become central to the political debate. And the problem is, the politicians will feel comfortable, for example, with the questions around regulating big tech, okay, because that's familiar to them. But what they're not familiar with is how do you use technology to revolutionize healthcare, to revolutionize the way we educate. My institute does programs all over Africa, right? There are the possibilities for technology today to help those countries bypass the legacy systems of the West and accelerate their economic and social development. How do we manage to do that? How do we take the energy of the people here and engage in a constructive way so that the things that they're inventing and the things that they're doing are allowed to change the way society works, the economy works, and even politics works? So the problem today is that you've got a real world revolution in this room, and then you've got politics in the other room, and the question is how you put that together. And look, obviously with my country at the moment, we've a few distractions. And what I will say to people in Britain is, the tragedy of Brexit, to which I am completely and wholly opposed, is that it distracts you from dealing with the big challenges. But actually all over the Western world today, you can see governments focusing the political debate on the left often attacking business, on the right attacking immigrants, when this technological question is the question we should be focusing on. And everything else, frankly, is a distraction right now.
Is one of the answers to that having a chief technology officer, essentially cabinet position, for example, the UK, or a CTO in the American government?
I think it has to go beyond that. I mean, of course, the chief technology officer would help, but I think what the Prime Minister is saying is that we are fundamentally having a technology revolution similar to the Industrial Revolution. When we debated Donald Trump's tax cuts in Congress, and I was opposed to them, but you literally, if you watch that debate, wouldn't know whether that debate was taking place in 2017 or 1980. The Democrats were making the same arguments, the Republicans were making the same arguments as they would have made in 1980. And no one was talking about how are we going to create new jobs given the technology revolution? What are we going to do to make sure there's not geographic inequality? What are we going to do to have thoughtful regulation so democracy is enhanced, not undermined based on these new platforms? So my view is that the central question of governance is how are we going to have thoughtful economic policy, thoughtful regulation to deal with the technology revolution. And that's sorely missing in Congress, that holistic perspective.
Tony, you once said that most politicians want to do the right thing, they just have a very limited knowledge of how the world is changing. So do you trust the politicians who say they want to regulate big tech?
Well, I think they're right in their instinct, but the question is to get the regulation right. And, the truth is the big tech has developed in a way where these companies have enormous power, enormous reach. It's inevitable there's going to be a desire to regulate them, but you've got to get the regulation right. And, I think these companies are almost akin to public utilities, but you don't want to regulate them in the way you would have regulated public utilities half a century ago. So it's all about, the more that politicians understand the world of technology, the more they're willing to partner with the world of technology, the more likely they're to get it right. I mean, your politicians are very simple people. What they don't understand, they don't like. And what they don't like, they will regulate, but often badly. So what is necessary is to get that engagement between the world of technology and the world of politics. And that's the central thing that has to happen. Now, there will be huge questions around the power of these companies because they're changing the world. And obviously, if you take many of these companies, they're having an impact on our society and indeed on our politics, which is bound to be subject to public interest regulation. But you need to get it right. And you need to understand that in the end, you can't just regulate by reacting to individual stories. You've got to take a step back and say, right, what is the power of these companies? How are they changing the world? And how does the public interest sit alongside that? But that's impossible to do unless you understand it properly. The only other thing I'd say, however, is that I think there is a risk that the whole debate about technology comes to a debate about big tech. Right? Technology is more than about big tech. It's about all those companies that are being created now, that are doing new things, that are innovating. We need that energy to be in the political room as well. And I understand, because I talk to a lot of people in the technology sector. My oldest son is actually in the sector himself. A lot of the time, these guys want to be far away from government as possible. I understand that. But it's necessary for the politicians to understand the world in order that they make the right policy. And this dislocation between the revolution that's happening on the ground and the political debate is worrying, and it's dangerous. And it's dangerous also because one of the other aspects is that the geopolitics is changing as well. Because with China and the power of China, especially in relation to technology, we have to work out a coherent position to that as well. So every time you come back and you look at the world today, you see this is the central challenge, and yet, as Ro was just saying, it's exactly the same. There's an election going on in Britain at the moment, but this is an election carried on in a way that was not dissimilar to the debate I had when I came into Parliament in 1983. Now, the world of 2019 is a bit different, but it's not impacting the political debate, and that's the problem.
Do you agree with the Facebook policy of allowing politicians to essentially lie in their paid advertisements?
I don't, and I think there's a solution to it. You could create a...
Dangerous to answer that one, yes.
Yeah. Facebook is required to remove content that has copyright violations. So there's no reason you can't have an independent regulatory agency that says if an ad is blatantly false, then Facebook should be given notification to remove it. And the problem with ads that are false, I mean, we've all had ads run against us on TV that are false. The problem, though, in social media is it becomes viral. It's not just the 2 weeks on television. It becomes viral and takes on a life of its own. So there's important need to regulate it. The challenge has been, look at the pace of change technologically. When Prime Minister Blair left office, Facebook may have had, a few 100,000 people. Today, it's 2 billion people, bigger than China, bigger than any country in the world. And the regulatory knowledge has not kept pace. When Sundar Pichai of Google was in front of Congress, you literally had a member of Congress hold up their iPhone and ask Sundar whether he could track the iPhone. And Sundar was patiently explaining that Apple made the iPhone, not Google. At this point, the member of Congress says, well, if I move 10 feet away, will you be able to track me? And Sundar says, well, it depends what apps you have on your phone. And the member of Congress says, don't lie to me. I don't care what you're saying. I don't know what apps are. Tell me if you can regulate me, or tell me if you can track me. So there is a lack of understanding about technology. We don't need computer scientists. We need people who basically have a curiosity about what's happening in the world and are up to the challenge of having thoughtful regulations for technology. The final point where I want to agree with Prime Minister Blair is that it's not just, though, about well-crafted regulations and privacy or political ads. It's about people's aspirations. A lot of people feel that their kids may not have as good a shot at the American dream or as economic opportunity because they don't know if they're going to have a shot at the jobs of the future. They want these jobs. They don't want to have their kids leave their hometowns to be able to participate in the 21st century economy. And that's the central challenge, in my view, for Silicon Valley. How do we create that economic opportunity in places that have felt left out?
We talked about people being left behind, but now we're essentially, it seems, in a new era where certain countries are creating their own internet. So you mentioned China, but Russia recently passed a law that will essentially allow them to create their own internet, their sovereign internet. Is that dangerous? And if it is, what is a way to get past that so that we don't have essentially an iron curtain on the web?
Well, I think it's difficult because I think this will arise particularly in relation to our attitude to China, where there is, again, a big debate, but I think it's still at a pretty niche level in Western politics, which is around this concept of do you decouple from China, or do you try and have some form of competitive cooperation or cooperative competition? I think this is really difficult, but what I would like to suggest is this is one area where America and Europe should be looking to work together. I mean, I think one big project for the transatlantic alliance, which still means something to me because the values that bind America and Europe together are strong and important, and we're both, in the end, whatever the temporary issues around our politics, we're defenders of liberal democracy, or we're based on concepts of liberal democracy. I think one thing that would be really good is for America and Europe to work out how they actually cooperate in the technological sphere, and how they make sure that in respect of China, and as China rises, they take a common position. Because, you know, this is the next stages of development, particularly around AI, will impact the world enormously. I mean, I want these next innovations to be innovations that are done by people who are subject to at least some form of regulatory framework and concepts around the values we believe in. So this is a big part of what we should be looking at today. And, you know, this again is where the current state of Western politics is depressing, frankly, because, you know, I don't know what happens to you, Ro, but whenever I go in different parts of the world today, there's a kind of competition between politicians as to whose politics is crazier. Right. Now, I think we're well ahead, by the way. I think we're right at the top there. I think, in fact, we've knocked the competition out of the park on this one. But at some point, when all of that clears, what are we going to be left with? And if we're right in saying that this technology revolution is the central question, this should be something where America and Europe are cooperating together. And I don't see that happening yet. Our own relationship is becoming transactional when it shouldn't be. It should actually be rooted in the values that bind the Western world together.
It's very important that the values we have drive technology and not think the other way around, that technology is somehow going to shape values. And our values of Europe and the United States is for liberal, pluralistic democracy that recognizes speech. That's very different than some of the values that China has had. And so my view is it's important for the United States and Europe to be engaged in helping define the regulations for the internet. I regret that the United States hasn't been able to participate as much in the conversation because our Congress has not had a privacy framework. We haven't had an antitrust framework. Frankly, I think there's been too much of a deferral on the regulatory framework to Europe. And whether you agree or disagree with the European framework, I think it would be helpful for a competition of ideas. And the United States should engage in that. We should have our own privacy framework. We should have our own antitrust framework, and then we can engage with European counterparts in defining that. The other thing I would say about China, the most important thing for the United States and Europe is to win the technology race. We can't afford to lose in artificial intelligence, in quantum computing, in biotechnology. We need to make those fundamental investments and be in the lead and make sure China is more dependent on our technology than vice versa.
We hear from some politicians that the answer to a lot of these questions is break up big tech. Should we do that?
Well, there needs to be more, I think, thinking about what the consequence and outcome is. What I would say is what you don't want is anti-competitive platforms, and you need to regulate technology so that they can't be anti-competitive and so that they can't just gobble up competition. Let me give you a concrete example. There was a small business in Michigan that wanted to sell T-shirts. They couldn't start a brick and mortar store. So Amazon did some ads. They allowed the business to succeed. That's a good thing. Then Amazon started copying those T-shirts and selling it online and undercut the business. So I would say what's relevant is make sure that Amazon can't do that on their platforms, that they can't advantage their own products. Make sure that Facebook, there's scrutiny if they're going to acquire Instagram or copy Snapchat. But just saying, let's break things up, I don't think is solving the issue of jobs or privacy. It has to be more nuanced, and real thinking needs to go into what the right solution is.
Tony, Monday, Edward Snowden called GDPR a paper tiger and that it's pretty much not working. Do you think GDPR, the data privacy protection, is a good step forward?
Yeah, no, you're going to need the data privacy protection. And no, I think that there's an ongoing debate about GDPR, but I think Europeans would regard themselves as pretty much at the forefront of how regulation happens. I mean, to my mind, what is important is, as we look at regulation, to create systems of regulation that are much more flexible and less bureaucratic than the past, because the technology is evolving so fast. You know, if you apply the old systems of regulation, they don't really work either. You know, that's why my institute just published a paper recently suggesting you need a different type of regulator, and you need a different expertise within those systems of regulation. So, you know, I think the debate around the system that Europe's got will continue. I guess my thing is more to say, how do America and Europe actually align on this? Because this would be, I think, to the benefit of both. Incidentally, I don't believe the thing that is really holding European tech back is to do with regulation. I think it's much more to do with the way we allow companies to grow, the way we stimulate business. I think there are a whole series of things that we could be doing in Europe that would allow our tech sector to become much more important, much more visible, much more powerful.
And I want to go back to something the Prime Minister said earlier, that the conversation is bigger than just GDPR or regulation or privacy. A lot of times when people talk about technology, that's the first question they ask. But to me, it's something more fundamental. Our politics are either about restoration of the past or an embrace of the future. At a very simple level, Donald Trump is saying, let's go back to the past. Let's go back to the way life used to be. And if you believe, as I do, in a multicultural democracy and that as a future for America, if you believe that we want to have multilateral institutions and move the world in that direction, you have to convince people that technology in the future is going to be a force for good in their lives, not a force of disruption. That, to me, is the central challenge for modern politics.
Yep.
Before we leave, I do want to sneak in a couple political questions. The first one will be pretty general, though. Do you think that tech will be a major topic in the 2020 election, Congressman?
Not a big enough topic. I mean, I really think that the question of jobs, of new industry, of how we're going to give people a place in this new economy while recognizing their rootedness should be a central question. And the only question that comes up is sort of, okay, how do you go after big tech? And I think that has a place. But I think there is an insufficient recognition of the technology revolution, globalization, and how we adapt the entire philosophic system or the entire economic ideology to address that.
And Prime Minister, are you going to vote Labor this election?
Yeah, I've said I will vote Labour. I've been a member of the Labour Party for 45 years. I was the leader for 13. I was the longest-serving Labour Prime Minister. Doesn't mean to say I agree with the direction of the present Labour Party, because I don't, frankly. But for me, and don't ask me what's going to happen this election, because I don't know. But for me, the single most important thing is for the type of politics that I represent, which is on the progressive centre-left side, is for us to take this technological revolution and weave it into a narrative of optimism about the future. Because in the end, the populism, whether it's the election of Donald Trump in the US, Brexit in the UK, you look at European politics, the same strands of populism, left and right actually, that are occurring. Populism exploits pessimism. Okay, when people are pessimistic about the future, they look for people to blame. If you're optimistic about the future, you're looking for the opportunities. And I'm actually optimistic about the future because I think this technology revolution will yield enormous benefits if we manage it correctly. But we need to manage it, we need to handle it, we need to think imaginatively about it. But this is why, for me, the key to defeating the populism is around this technology question. Because when I look at the constituents I used to represent in the north of England, in respect of healthcare, I can see how much it can change their lives. In respect of education, I can see how much it can change their lives. In respect of transport, even law and order, I can think of whole ways we can reimagine the welfare system, the pension system, through the use of technology. I can see government having a completely different interaction with the citizen as a result of technology. I can see, for example, how an electronic and biometric identity can allow us to resolve some of the challenges around immigration. So in each of these areas, I see technology as the way, if we don't just let it happen, but if we apply values and reason and rational analysis and good policy making, I can see how this technological revolution can be turned into that narrative of optimism. And if you look back to the 19th century, it's amazing how the conversation between politicians at the time in the 1820s and 1830s carried on in the old way when it was obvious the world was being revolutionized around them. And then later in the century, politics caught up. I want to see politics catch up now. I want to see a whole new relationship between the world of politics and the world of technology. And I believe ultimately the answer to these populist challenges and to the rehabilitation of the West as a place of values and decency and good politics and the future lies in the cooperation between technology and the world of policymakers. And that's what we're trying to do.
And in the last 5 seconds, would Labour do better without Jeremy Corbyn as leader?
Such a rough question to ask me. I mean, there was I giving you this stirring speech about technology and how it's changing the world, and you just asked me that type of question, which is not really a question I should answer.
On a lighter note, I will say a positive aspect of... on a lighter note, I'll tell you, someone on Twitter sent me Boris Johnson's Diwali greetings, saying Boris Johnson's Diwali greetings were much better than my own. He may not do Brexit right, but he gets Diwali right. But I thought to myself, look at what an interesting world. The grandson of an Indian freedom fighter. My grandfather fought with Gandhi for 4 years, born in America, the British Prime Minister giving Diwali greetings, and all of this communication happening on the internet platforms. There's a lot of hope about what can happen.
It's a great thing, and by the way, it would be really good if Boris from now on sticks to Diwali.
Well, that is, we're giving you Flash Dread. That's all the time we have. Thank you very much. Thank you to our esteemed guests, and enjoy the rest of your conference.